At 9:45 in the morning on November 14, 1943, the sky over the Solomon Islands was a perfect, bright blue. Lieutenant James Jim Miller sat in the pilot seat of his B-24 Liberator, a heavy bomber nicknamed the Glass House, watching his fuel meters go down. He was 20,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, and he was completely alone. The rest of his group had turned back 30 minutes ago because of engine problems, but Miller had kept going. Now he was sorry about that choice. Far below him, against the dark blue water, he saw the shine of sunlight on metal. It wasn't one plane. It was a bunch. 15 Japanese A-6M0 fighters were climbing in a tight circle, looking like a group of sharks smelling blood in the water. Miller grabbed the control stick and checked on his crew. The B-24 was a huge plane. It was faster and could fly longer distances than the famous B-17 Flying Fortress, but it had a reputation for being hard to fly. The pilots called it the flying boxcar because it handled like a brick with wings. It was heavy, wore out the pilots, and had one deadly problem that every Japanese pilot in the Pacific knew about. The early model B-24s did not have a ball turret, that spinning glass bubble on the bottom of the plane that carried 2 machine guns. Instead, the belly of Miller's plane was just a flat sheet of metal. It was a blind spot as big as a barn door. The Japanese pilots were smart. They didn't attack from the front, where the nose gunner could see them. They didn't attack from the top, where the turret gunner could tear them apart. They attacked from directly below. They would fly into the bomber's shadow, match its speed, and then pull up into a straight climb. They would hang there, held up by their propellers, and spray the belly of the bomber with 20mm cannon fire. The American gunners inside could hear the shells hitting the floor, but they couldn't shoot back. They were helpless. It was like fighting a boxer who was allowed to punch you in the kidneys while your hands were tied to your chest. Miller watched the Zeros line up. They were taking their time. They knew the Glass House was alone. They knew it had no fighter escort. And most importantly, they knew it had a blind belly. They split into 3 groups of 5. The first group sped up, diving low to get into the killing position beneath the bomber. Miller felt a knot of fear tighten in his stomach. He knew the normal procedure. The manual said to weave the plane, to turn left and right to give the side gunners a shot. But turning a heavy bomber at 20,000 feet killed your speed and made you a sitting duck. The manual was a death sentence. This exact situation was why Miller had almost been court-martialed 3 days earlier on the runway at Guadalcanal. The argument had happened in the hot sun, right under the wing of the bomber. Miller and his crew chief, a red-headed sergeant named O'Malley from Chicago, had been standing there with a toolbox and a crazy idea. They were staring at the camera hatch in the tail section of the plane. It was a small square door in the floor made for taking spy photos. During combat missions, it was supposed to be bolted shut and sealed to keep air pressure and smooth flying. Miller wanted to take the door off completely. He wanted to fly a combat mission with a huge hole in the bottom of his plane. And he didn't just want a hole. He wanted to attach a twin 50 caliber machine gun package on a bungee cord hanging system right over the opening. It was a homemade fix, which is the Army's polite way of saying they were rigging it up with spare parts and hope. The idea was simple. If the Zeros attacked from below, O'Malley would strap himself into a safety harness, lean over the hole, and fire straight down. It was the only way to cover the blind spot. The base colonel had walked up while they were removing the bolts from the hatch. He was a by-the-book officer, a man who believed that rules were written by smart people and followed by soldiers. He looked at the missing hatch, then at the bungee cords, then at Miller. He turned a shade of purple that matched exhaust flames. He told Miller that he had lost his mind. He explained the science of the situation as if Miller were a child. He said that opening a hatch at 200 miles per hour would create huge drag. It would act like a parachute, slowing the bomber down and burning fuel they couldn't afford to waste. The colonel also pointed out the human cost. The open hatch would suck the oxygen out of the plane. At 20,000 feet, the air is thin and freezing. The crew would be fighting extreme cold and lack of oxygen. And then there was the gunner. O'Malley would be hanging over open space, beaten by a 100-mile-per-hour wind, trying to aim a heavy machine gun. The colonel called it a death trap. He said that if the plane didn't crash from the drag, the gunner would fall out or the structure of the plane would fail. He forbade it. He ordered the hatch sealed and told Miller that if he changed the aircraft again, he would be grounded permanently. Miller had nodded, said yes, sir, and waited for the colonel to drive away in his jeep. As soon as the dust settled, he turned to O'Malley. They didn't put the door back on. They didn't remove the bungee cords. Instead, they covered the hole with a piece of canvas that looked like the metal skin of the plane. It was a flimsy disguise, but it would pass a quick inspection. They were betting their careers and their lives that the colonel wouldn't check the belly of the plane before takeoff. They were gambling that the danger of the Japanese Zeros was greater than the danger of an angry commanding officer. Now, 3 days later, that gamble was being tested. The canvas tarp was still covering the hole in the floor near the tail. The bungee-mounted gun was stored against the wall, hidden under a pile of flak jackets. O'Malley was at his station, wearing his oxygen mask, waiting for the order. The Zeros were moving into position. Miller could see them disappearing under the wings of the B-24. They were sliding into the blind spot. The trap was set, but the trap wasn't set by the Americans. It was set by the Japanese. The first Zero pilot adjusted his throttle. He was confident. He had done this a dozen times before. He looked up and saw the fat gray belly of the American bomber. It was just a smooth expanse of metal. There were no turrets, no gun barrels pointing down. It was defenseless. He pulled back on his stick, bringing the nose of his fighter up. He lined up his sights on the fuel tanks between the engines. He switched the safety off his 20mm cannons. He was going to cut the bomber in half. Inside the B-24, the intercom crackled. It was the tail gunner. His voice was high and tight with fear. He reported that he could see the Zeros dipping below the tail. They were gone from his view. He couldn't shoot them. The side gunners reported the same thing. They were leaning out their windows, trying to angle their guns down, but the body of the plane was in the way. They were blocked. The enemy was right there, maybe 500 feet away, but they were invisible to the guns. Miller watched his speed indicator, 210 miles per hour. If they opened the hatch now, the rush of air would be violent. It could rip the tail off the plane. It could suck O'Malley right out the hole if his harness failed. It was a crazy idea on the ground. Up here, in the thin air of the death zone, it felt like madness. But then Miller heard the first sound of impact. It was the sound of Japanese bullets hitting the aluminum skin of the plane. They were finding the range. The next burst would hit the fuel tanks. The next burst would turn the glass house into a fireball. Miller didn't hesitate anymore. He pressed the transmit button on his throat microphone. He didn't ask for a volunteer. He didn't ask if the equipment was ready. He just gave the order that would either save them or kill them all. "O'Malley," he said, his voice flat and hard over the roar of the engines, "pop the hatch." When Sergeant O'Malley kicked the canvas tarp away from the camera hatch, the war changed instantly. It didn't feel like opening a door. It felt like a bomb going off inside the plane. The air pressure difference at 20,000 feet is violent. The air inside the cabin was relatively still, but the air outside was rushing past at 200 miles per hour. When the barrier vanished, the wind roared into the belly of the plane with the force of a hurricane. It ripped the remaining shreds of canvas from the bolts and sent loose debris flying into the tail section, like flying metal. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in a single second. The comfortable, humid warmth of the tropical air was replaced by a freezing blast that cut right through the flight suits. Up in the cockpit, Lieutenant Miller felt the change immediately. It felt as if a giant hand had reached up from the ocean and grabbed the tail of the bomber. The plane lurched violently to the left, then shuddered as the smooth flying was ruined. The smooth airflow over the belly was gone, replaced by a turbulent whirlwind that dragged at the body. Miller had to fight the control stick with both hands, his muscles straining to keep the wings level. The speed indicator dropped. 210, 200, 190. The drag was acting like a parachute, sucking the speed out of the heavy bomber. The fuel gauges, already low, seemed to dip just from the extra strain on the engines. Back in the belly, O'Malley was fighting to stay on his feet. The wind was screaming so loud it drowned out the roar of the 4 massive Pratt and Whitney engines. He grabbed the safety line attached to the ceiling ribs a thick nylon strap he had stolen from a cargo parachute. He clipped it onto the back of his harness. This was the only thing keeping him from falling 5 miles into the Pacific Ocean. He tested the tension, leaning back against the strap. It held. He looked down at the hole. It was a square of terrifying blue, framing the whitecaps of the waves far below. It was a window into the abyss. Next to the hole hung the weapon. It was a standard M2 Browning .50 caliber machine gun stripped of its heavy stand. Instead of a solid metal mount, O'Malley had rigged it up with a cluster of heavy-duty industrial bungee cords wrapped around the ceiling beams. The gun hung suspended in the air, bouncing slightly with the vibration of the plane. It looked ridiculous. It looked like a child's toy swing, but the bungees served a critical purpose. They absorbed the violent kickback of the gun, and more importantly, they allowed O'Malley to swing the weapon freely in any direction. It was a floating gun, untied by gears or motors. O'Malley grabbed the handles of the heavy machine gun. He wrestled it into position, pointing the barrel straight down through the open hatch. The wind caught the barrel and tried to rip it out of his hands, pushing it backward. He had to lean his entire body weight onto the weapon to keep it steady. He stepped up to the edge of the hole, placing his boots on the narrow metal rim of the hatch frame. One slip and his leg would go through, likely breaking the bone against the metal edge or leaving him dangling by his harness in the freezing wind. He planted his feet, gritted his teeth against the cold, and looked down. The view was perfect. Below him, the first wave of Japanese Zeros was climbing. They were beautiful, deadly machines painted in dark green with the bright red circle of the rising sun on their wings. They were in a tight formation, noses pointed up, propellers clawing for height. To the Japanese pilots, the bomber looked asleep. They saw no turrets spinning. They saw no gun barrels tracking them. They were flying into the blind spot with the confidence of executioners. They were less than 800 yards away now, closing fast. They were so close. O'Malley could see the oil streaks on their engine covers. The Japanese pilots were staring at the belly of the B-24, waiting for the right moment to open fire. They expected to see nothing but aluminum skin. Instead, the lead pilot saw a square hole open up. He might have been confused for a tenth of a second. He might have thought the bomber was dumping garbage or that it had taken damage. He certainly did not expect to see a man in a leather flight jacket hanging halfway out of the plane, wrestling a machine gun that was spitting fire directly into his face. O'Malley didn't fire a warning shot. He clamped down on the trigger and held it. The heavy machine gun roared to life, shaking in his hands like a jackhammer. The bungee cord stretched and snapped, absorbing the kick. The brass shell casings shot out from the side of the gun and were instantly sucked out of the hole by the wind, raining down into the ocean. A stream of tracers, bright lines of burning magnesium, erupted from the belly of the bomber. But unlike normal turret fire that curves out, this fire went straight down. It was a vertical column of death. The physics of the fight were brutally unfair to the Japanese. Usually when a fighter attacks a bomber, the bullets hit the wings or the body at an angle, often bouncing off the rounded surfaces. But O'Malley was firing down into the top of the Zeros. He was shooting through the thinnest part of their armor. The .50 caliber rounds, each the size of a marker pen, smashed into the engine blocks and cockpits of the climbing fighters. Gravity was helping the bullets, adding speed and energy to the impact. The lead Zero flew right into the stream. The pilot never had a chance to dodge. The heavy rounds punched through the glass canopy and the thin aluminum engine cover. The fighter shuddered as the engine block cracked. A cloud of black smoke erupted from the nose, blinding the pilot. The plane stalled instantly, its upward speed crushed by the damage. It rolled over onto its back, shedding pieces of covering, and began a death spiral toward the water. The second Zero, the wingman, was right behind the leader. He was so focused on staying in formation that he didn't realize what had happened until he flew through the debris of the first plane. He looked up and saw the muzzle flash sparkling from the open hatch. He tried to turn away, to roll out of the line of fire, but a Zero in a vertical climb is slow. It's hanging on its propeller. It doesn't have the speed to move quickly. It was like trying to steer a car on ice. O'Malley swung the floating gun on its bungee cords, tracking the movement with ease. He walked the tracers across the second plane's right wing. The Japanese Zeros were famous for being nimble, but they were also famous for being fragile. They lacked self-sealing fuel tanks. A single fire-starting round in the wing could turn the whole plane into a torch. O'Malley's burst found the fuel tank. There was a bright flash of orange fire, silent over the roar of the wind. The wings simply separated from the body. The Zero broke apart in midair, turning into a cloud of burning aluminum and gasoline. 2 down. Up in the cockpit, Miller could feel the vibrations of the gun firing through the floorboards. He felt a dull kickback, fighting against the frame. He didn't need the intercom to know what was happening. A single fire-starting round in the wing could turn the whole plane into a torch. O'Malley's burst found the fuel tank. There was a bright flash of orange fire, silent over the roar of the wind. The wings simply separated from the body. The Zero broke apart in midair, turning into a cloud of burning aluminum and gasoline. 2 down. Up in the cockpit, Miller could feel the vibrations of the gun firing through the floorboards. He felt a dull kickback, fighting against the frame. He didn't need the intercom to know what was happening to Mattyon in panic. They had flown into a trap. They dove away, scattering like birds frightened by a gunshot. They couldn't understand where the fire was coming from. It went against their training. It went against the diagrams of the B-24 they had studied. They pulled back to a safe distance, buzzing angrily around the bomber, trying to make sense of the new reality. O'Malley let off the trigger. The gun barrel was smoking hot, the heat waves shimmering in the freezing air. He was panting, his breath fogging up his goggles. His arms ached from wrestling the heavy weapon against the wind. He looked down at the ocean. 2 black smears of oil and burning wreckage marked the graves of the first 2 attackers. He pulled the charging handle back on the machine gun, ejecting a bad round and seating a fresh one. He checked the ammunition belt. It was feeding smoothly from the box bolted to the wall. The makeshift rig was holding, but the fight wasn't over. The Japanese pilots were elite veterans. They didn't panic for long. They regrouped 1,000 yards below and behind the bomber. They were talking to each other on their radios, pointing out the open hatch. They realized what the Americans had done. They saw the single gun hanging there. They did the math. 1 gun, 1 narrow field of fire, and there were still 13 Zeros left. The squadron leader rocked his wings, signaling the others. They weren't going to attack in a single-file line anymore. That was a mistake. They were going to swarm. They split into 2 groups. One group moved to the left, the other to the right. They began to climb again, but this time they spread out. They planned to attack from both sides at the same time, coming together on the belly of the bomber in a V-shape. They knew O'Malley couldn't shoot at 2 targets at once. If he turned to shoot the left group, the right group would destroy the bomber. If he shot the right, the left would kill him. Miller saw the trick from the cockpit. He watched the fighters split and widen their formation. "They're trapping us," he yelled over the intercom. "O'Malley, you've got bandits at 4 o'clock low and 8 o'clock low. They're coming all at once." O'Malley looked down. He saw the trap closing. The Zeros were climbing fast now, engines screaming. They were angry. They were coming for blood. The easy shooting was over. Now it was a brawl. O'Malley tightened his grip on the handles. He checked his safety harness one last time. He knew he couldn't stop them all. He just hoped he could kill enough of them to make the rest flinch. He swung the gun to the left, waiting for the first nose to cross his sights. The wind howled through the open hatch, sounding like a chorus of screaming ghosts. The sky beneath the bomber turned into a kaleidoscope of violence. The 13 remaining Japanese fighters didn't come up in a polite line this time. They coordinated their attack with the precision of a wolf pack, taking down a bison. 7 Zeros banked hard to the left, dropping low to gain speed before pulling up. 6 Zeros mirrored the move on the right. They were timing their climb, so they would arrive at the belly of the B-24 at the exact same second. It was a classic pincer movement designed to split the gunner's attention and force him to expose his back to half the enemy force. O'Malley stood on the edge of the open hatch, his boots slipping on the freezing metal rim. The wind was tearing at his flight suit, flapping the leather jacket against his ribs like a drum. He saw the 2 groups climbing. He knew he couldn't shoot them all. The math was simple and terrifying. The M2 Browning fired 800 rounds per minute. The Zeros were closing at 300 miles per hour. He had maybe 4 seconds to fight the left group before the right group was in range to blow him out of the sky. He had to make a choice. He chose the left. He swung the heavy gun on its bungee suspension. The rubber cords groaned under the tension, stretching out like giant rubber bands. He leaned his entire body weight into the turn, fighting the wind that tried to push the barrel back. He didn't aim for a specific plane. He aimed for the space in front of them, creating a curtain of steel. He clamped the trigger down. The gun bucked and roared. A wall of tracers erupted from the hatch, slashing across the sky in a bright, deadly arc. The lead Zero on the left flew straight into the saw blade. The .50 caliber rounds didn't just poke holes. They tore chunks of metal off the airframe. The pilot tried to roll away, but the bullets walked up his body like a chainsaw. One round hit the ammunition drum for his 20mm cannon. The wing exploded from the inside out. The Zero didn't fall. It simply broke apart into a cloud of confetti and fire. The pilot behind him flew through the fireball. His windshield instantly coated in oil and soot. Blinded, he pulled up hard, narrowly missing the bomber's tail, and fell out of the fight. But while O'Malley was shredding the left side, the right side was closing in. The 6 Zeros on the right side had a clear shot. They climbed vertically, their engines screaming. The pilots looked up and saw the gunner's back turned to them. They saw the open hatch. They saw the vulnerable fuel lines and the bomb bay doors. They pressed their firing buttons. Cannon shells began to hammer the belly of the B-24. It sounded like someone was throwing handfuls of gravel against a tin roof. Only the gravel was exploding metal. Shrapnel pinged through the floorboards. A jagged piece of steel sliced through O'Malley's pant leg, missing his calf by an inch. The plane lurched as a shell punched a hole in the right stabilizer. Up in the cockpit, Miller wrestled with the controls. The bomber wanted to roll over and die. The drag from the open hatch combined with the damage to the tail made the plane handle like a dump truck with flat tires. Miller yelled over the intercom, "Brake right, braking right." He hauled the control stick over, throwing the heavy bomber into a violent bank. This wasn't standard procedure. You weren't supposed to bank a bomber during a gunfight because it threw off the gunner's aim. But Miller wasn't trying to help O'Malley aim. He was trying to save O'Malley's life. By banking the plane, he shifted the angle of the body. The Zeros attacking from the right suddenly lost their clean shot at the belly. Instead of a flat target, they were looking at a steep sliding wall of aluminum. The trick threw O'Malley off his feet. The floor tilted 45 degrees. He slipped on the slick metal and fell toward the open hole. For a heart-stopping second, he was sliding out into the abyss. His boots kicked at empty air. He clawed at the floor, his gloves scraping against the rivets. The safety harness snapped tight, catching him with a brutal jerk that knocked the wind out of his lungs. He was dangling halfway out of the plane, 5 miles above the ocean, staring straight down at the sharks. Most men would have frozen. Most men would have scrambled back inside and curled up in a ball. O'Malley wasn't most men. He realized that falling out of the plane had actually given him a better angle. He was now hanging below the body, completely clear of the structure. He had a 360-degree view of the battle. He grabbed the handles of the machine gun, which was bouncing wildly on its bungees next to him. He pulled the weapon down to his level. He was fighting upside down, suspended by a nylon strap, spinning in the wind. He saw the Zeros on the right side trying to adjust to Miller's turn. They were slow, hanging on their props. O'Malley squeezed the trigger. He fired from the hips, spraying bullets like he was watering a lawn with a fire hose. The angle was impossible. The Japanese pilots had never seen a gunner firing from outside the plane. They flew right into the spray. One of the Zeros took a round through the propeller hub. The prop shattered, sending shrapnel slicing into the cockpit. The plane stalled and dropped like a stone. Another Zero took a hit to the oil cooler. A stream of white smoke erupted from the engine, trailing behind it like a ghostly ribbon. The pilot broke off, diving for the safety of the clouds. The formation on the right shattered. They couldn't handle the chaos. They couldn't handle the madman hanging from a strap, turning their perfect ambush into a barroom brawl. Miller leveled the plane out. O'Malley scrambled back inside, his muscles burning with lactic acid. He dragged the heavy gun back up with him. He checked the ammo belt. It was running dry. The red tracer rounds, usually placed every fifth bullet, were coming up fast. That meant he had maybe 50 shots left, a 3-second burst. And there were still 8 Zeros circling below, regrouping for another pass. The Japanese pilots were careful now. They had lost 4 planes in 2 minutes. They knew the belly wasn't blind anymore, but they also knew the B-24 was damaged. They could see the smoke trailing from the right engine. They could see the holes in the tail. They decided to change tactics. Instead of a coordinated group attack, they would try a kamikaze-style charge. One by one, they would sprint straight up, fire a quick burst, and peel away. They would peck the bomber to death. The first one came up fast, weaving back and forth to throw off O'Malley's aim. O'Malley didn't take the bait. He waited. He knew he didn't have the ammo to spray and pray. He had to be a sniper with a machine gun. He watched the Zero get bigger in the hatch frame. 800 yards, 600, 400. He could see the pilot's face behind the goggles. He could see the muzzle flashes of the Zero's machine gun sparkling. Bullets zipped past the open hatch, punching holes in the ceiling of the bomber. O'Malley stood like a statue, ignoring the lead buzzing around his head like angry hornets. At 200 yards, he fired a short, controlled burst. 6 rounds. That was it. But at point-blank range, 6 rounds of 50 caliber armor-piercing fire-starting ammunition is enough to kill anything that flies. The bullets smashed into the Zero's nose. The engine block shattered. The fighter's speed carried it upward, dead in the air. It drifted closer, looming ominously in the hatch, a smoking wreck threatening to crash into the bomber. O'Malley could have reached out and touched the wingtip as it stalled and fell away backward, tumbling end over end toward the sea. The gun clicked empty. The belt was empty. O'Malley cursed. Ammo, he screamed into the intercom. I'm dry. Reloading. He dropped the empty ammo box and kicked it aside. He grabbed a fresh box from the stack bolted to the wall. It weighed 35 pounds. The plane was bouncing through turbulence, making it hard to stand. He fumbled with the latch, his fingers numb from the cold. He ripped the lid off and pulled out the start of the belt. Below him, the next Zero was already climbing. The pilot saw the gun stop firing. He saw his chance. He pushed his throttle to the firewall. He was coming for the kill. O'Malley flipped the feed cover of the machine gun open. He jammed the fresh belt onto the feed tray. The fighter was 300 yards out. O'Malley slammed the cover down. It didn't latch. Debris or ice was blocking the mechanism. The Zero was 200 yards out, cannons firing. Explosions walked across the belly of the bomber, shaking O'Malley's teeth. He smashed his fist onto the feed cover. Once, twice. The mechanism locked. He grabbed the charging handle and ripped it back, loading a round. The Zero was 100 yards away, filling the entire view of the hatch. It was so close it blocked out the ocean. O'Malley didn't aim. He just buried the trigger. The gun roared. The stream of tracers went straight down the throat of the attacking fighter. The Zero pilot flinched. He pulled up hard to avoid the fire, but he was too close. The burst caught him in the cockpit. The canopy shattered. The plane jerked violently to the right, missing the open hatch by feet. The wash from its propeller slammed into O'Malley, knocking him backward against the wall. The sound of the screaming engine was deafening, a physical roar that vibrated in his chest. Then it was gone, falling away into the blue. That was the breaking point. The remaining 6 Zeros had seen enough. They had watched their squadron get chewed up by a single gun in a suicide door. They had watched their wingmen explode, burn, and spiral into the sea. They were low on fuel. They were low on ammo. And they were terrified of the crazy American hanging out of the bottom of the plane. The leader rocked his wings, signaling a retreat. They banked away, diving for the deck, running for home. O'Malley didn't cheer. He didn't wave his fist. He just slumped against the wall of the body, sliding down until he hit the floor. The wind was still howling through the open hatch, freezing the sweat on his face. The machine gun hung on its bungee cords, smoking and swaying gently like a pendulum. The floor around the hatch was covered in a carpet of hot brass casings and steel belt links. Up in the cockpit, Miller watched the Zeros disappear into the clouds. He let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for an hour. He checked the gauges. The number 3 engine was overheating. The hydraulic pressure was dropping. The tail control was mushy, but the sky was empty. Clear, he whispered into his mask. Then he keyed to Mike O'Malley. You still with us back there? There was a long pause. Static crackled on the line. Then a tired, shaky voice came back. Yes, Skipper, I'm here. But I think we're going to need a new door. I kind of shot the hinges off the old one. Miller cracked a smile. It was the first time he had smiled in 6 hours. He adjusted the trim tabs, fighting the drag of the open hatch one last time. They were alive. They had flown a brick through a meat grinder and come out the other side. Don't worry about the door, Red, Miller said. I think the Colonel is going to have bigger things to worry about when we get back. The flight back to Guadalcanal was the longest 2 hours of Jim Miller's life. The B-24 Glasshouse was a flying wreck. The number 3 engine finally gave up the ghost 10 miles out from the island, coughing a black cloud of smoke before seizing up completely. Miller had to feather the prop, turning the blade sideways to slice through the wind. The hydraulic system was shot, which meant the landing gear had to be hand-cranked down by the crew. It was a grueling, sweat-soaked effort. O'Malley and the side gunners took turns spinning the emergency wheel in the walkway, their arms screaming in protest, counting the rotations until the wheels locked into place. They crossed the runway threshold at 140 miles per hour, coming in hot. Miller fought the controls all the way down. The damage to the tail made the plane want to turn to the left, drifting toward the jungle at the edge of the runway. He slammed his boot on the right rudder pedal, forcing the nose straight. The tires screeched against the crushed coral of the runway. The bomber bounced once, twice, then settled. Miller stood on the brakes. The plane shuddered and groaned, bleeding off speed until it finally came to a halt at the far end of the airfield. The prop spun down to a stop. Silence rushed back in, louder than the engines had ever been. They were alive. But as Miller looked out the cockpit window, his relief turned back into dread. A jeep was already racing across the runway toward them. It wasn't the medical truck. It wasn't the fuel truck. It was the command jeep. The colonel was in the passenger seat. He looked like a storm cloud wrapped in khaki. He had seen the plane land. He had seen the missing hatch. He knew exactly what they had done. Miller and his crew climbed out of the side door. They dropped onto the hot coral, their legs wobbly. They looked like coal miners. Their faces were black with soot and oil. Their flight suits were stiff with sweat and salt spray. O'Malley was limping, favoring the leg that had been grazed by shrapnel. They stood in a ragged line under the wing of their broken bird. The legacy of the tunnel gun isn't about the kill count. It isn't about the 7 zeros that went into the drink that day. It's about the mindset. It's about the refusal to accept a fatal flaw. Miller and O'Malley looked at a problem that everyone said was unsolvable, and they solved it by breaking every rule in the book. They proved that sometimes the safest place to be is hanging by a strap over the edge of the world, fighting back. We rescue these stories to ensure Jim Miller and Red O'Malley don't disappear into silence. They represent a generation that didn't wait for permission to survive. They built a solution with their own hands, tested it with their own lives, and walked away when the job was done. So, the next time you see a rule that doesn't make sense or a problem that seems impossible, remember the glass house, remember the open hatch, and remember that sometimes you have to open the door to let the hurricane in.